Welcome to the Renegade Report. I'm Jonathan.
And Ramon is present. Hi, Jonathan. Are you well?
Yes, I am. You did half cut out your name there, but it's okay. You're a household one now, so no problem.
Well, not yet. Hopefully quite soon. I mean, you start a podcast, become the most downloaded podcast in the country. No one cares. You start one small political party, and now everyone, loses their minds.
Yes, well, we do have to deal with the giant purple cow in the room, which is that the anarchist has started a political party. And I mean, just a few months ago, as Michael Cardo has pointed out, you were calling voters idiots. So, and not voters themselves, but anyone who engages in the act of voting. So do you want to address that quickly?
Well, it's very simple. As a capitalist, one sees gaps in the market. And it wasn't just me, by the way. It was my co-conspirator will join us in a moment. But you see a gap in the market and you think, listen, here are all the available options for my vote. And I don't like any of them. So a true capitalist says, fine, let's start our own and compete. And that's exactly what has happened. So now that there's a party that represents me and what I believe in, they will have my vote. Because the pragmatic reality of the world is political power exists. So you can fight against it from the outside, or you can create a party, join the political powerful positions, and then work your magic within that to make it more accountable.
So it's not that you're not an anarchist. It's just that you accept that an anarchy has certain things need to happen to exist. For example, the non-existence of a government, and we actually have a government. So you're working within the framework. Is that a fair description?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's strategy 101. You can fight it on the outside, or you can join it and sort of try undermine it or try to minimize its power from the inside. And that's my rationale for being a co-founder of the party. And there you go. I'm sticking by that.
100%. Well, before we bring your other co-founder on, perhaps we should talk about Cyril engaging in real-life metaphors, where he decides to get on a train with the intention of campaigning, because he's a man of the people. When he's not smoking Cuban cigars and drinking very, very expensive alcohol in his many mansions that he owns and checking the billions in his bank accounts, he's a man of the people. So, of course, the first thing you do is you get on a train, and then the train breaks down, and then I think they get a second train, and then that train breaks down. This is quite hilarious.
Well, what is interesting, it took him 4 hours to travel 40 kilometers.
It's just marvelous, and really it is a great metaphor for where the country is at the moment, and just the management of the ANC and the management of government as a whole.
There's no own like a self-own, and that was marvelous. You couldn't script that better. This is Laurel and Hardy on steroids. It was phenomenal. A parody wouldn't, you can't make a parody or satirize South Africa in this case, because real life is just absurd, and this is a great example of that. But yeah, I think let's move on to the guest, Jonathan.
All right, let's move on to the guest. The guest is none other than Kanthan Pillay. Most of you should be familiar with Kanthan for a number of reasons. Heard on this podcast before, well known in the broadcasting and media industry, and now the co-founder and chairman, although he doesn't really like that title too much, I think, of the South African Capitalist Party, or the Zacp. Kanthan, welcome.
Thank you. Well, and yes, you're quite right. I don't like the term chairman. We had to supply the name of a chairman and a treasurer to the IEC because they have rules that call for that. I prefer to think of myself as first among equals. I think that's a good way to describe it. And actually, there are three of us who are co-founders. It's myself and Roman and Nail. And so we were the three original co-conspirators, and we then set off to recruit the others who came in?
All right. Well, I think I'm going to have to be the sort of impartial person in this discussion, because obviously we want to find out what's brought about the Capitalist Party. We want to discuss some of your manifesto points. We want to discuss some of the criticism around it. But both you and Ramon obviously are members of the party. Will I assumptively be voting for yourselves come the 8th of May, and very much believe in what you're doing. And I'd like to try and push back a little bit, even though I do think you've got some great ideas. So perhaps let's start off with, you know, the criticism, the comment that you guys, you've sold it as a plus. You guys are not politicians. So the criticism is, you're not politicians, you've got no governmental experience. Kind of how dare you start a party and expect to go to Parliament of all places? You should know your place.
Well, the short answer that I'm going to give out there is that, you know, Ramaphosa spent a decade pretending to be a businessman. So it's about time for us to have a chance to pretend to be politicians. I mean, what's wrong with that?
Fair enough.
I think the crucial thing, though,
answer?
Well, we think that we'll make better politicians than Ramaphosa was a businessman. I mean, you know, frankly, the only reason why he was a successful businessman was because of the color of his skin. He got handed stuff across. He got handed Jonic, which was one of the biggest companies on the JSE. It no longer exists. Why does it no longer exist? Because he ran it into the ground. Yeah. The man is a failed businessman.
All right. So fair enough. What brings you guys to go, all right, well, you know, we're not going to hop onto another platform. You've got an extensive history in the country's politics. You know a lot of the people involved in the struggle. You yourself were involved in various sort of actions and campaigns and projects over the years. Why not do a Makosi Koza, initially try to fix the party from within and then maybe leave, but do an ANC light? Or why not join on to COPE? Or the IFP has some quite liberal principles within it still. Why the South African Capitalist Party? Excuse me, I almost said communist.
Well, the starting point for me, the thing that kind of triggered me really was, and I spoke about this at our launch, which was just yesterday. And actually, it was this image of this young girl who drowned in a pit toilet. And the realization that the 400 people who are sitting in the National Assembly actually are completely clueless and don't know how to do anything. And so the question then becomes not really whether one can reform them from within, but really whether they are capable of being reformed in the first place. And I don't believe they are, because in order for one to actually ascend through the hierarchy, or maybe descend into the morass is probably a better way of describing it, of all of the existing political parties, you need to be prepared to accommodate all of these people along the way who are incapable of doing anything other than to jockey for position. So instead of fixing it, the idea is instead come on board with the bulldozer and actually try and plow your way through the entire thing, and hopefully that way build something better. And I think at that point I said, well, who is the most obvious person that I should be pulling on board? And I then immediately picked up the phone and called two people. So I called Roman and I called Neo, and then I met with Roman and I met with Neo. And that's where this entire thing started. And
Ramon, because obviously I've known about the background of this for a little while, but you guys have kept your cards close to your chest. So initially you jumped at it, or you were kind of a little bit not sure?
So, well, I mean, if Kanthan says do something, you sort of say yes without thinking too hard about it. So I was concerned about the name, if I'm honest with you. the Capitalist Party. I like it, but I thought it might be a little bit too edgy for most people. And then I realized this was a year ago, 18 months ago even, and I said, well, listen, I'm not a consensus-seeking type of person. I'm quite principled on various things, and I've got lines in the sand that won't be that are drawn and won't be crossed by me, and I'll fight anyone who does cross them. And I thought, well, yes, there you go. So imagine a party that is unashamedly capitalist, and if you understand that most people in the world, in fact, everyone in the world who takes part in a society is essentially capitalist. It makes perfect sense to call it that. And yeah, I've known Kanthan for a number of years, and I have, as I said, a lot of trust and a lot of faith in him. And then when he knocked on the door and he said, let's do this, I thought that is utterly insane and brilliant. Let's do it.
Yeah, I think what's quite interesting as well is it's very easy to underestimate this. We have people who listen to the show, and many of those listeners will be kind of disgruntled DA voters, in the sense that there was always a belief that the DA stood for a certain number of principles. Those principles were generally quite centrist. In the South African context, they're centre-right because we too lean quite far left. And as the DA has tried to become more what they accuse everyone else of, populist, they seem to have lost some of those fundamental principles. And so you can correct me if I'm wrong, but you guys, this party seems to fulfill a role as a centre-right party that we basically don't have. And perhaps some of the reaction to that, some of the reaction to it and some of the animosity is maybe a little feeling deep down inside that, the swing we've seen in some European countries and the Americas, where people are rejecting leftist ideology, leftist government, may start to happen in South Africa. And if that happens, you're suddenly the number one candidates.
Roman, I don't know whether you want to pick that up first. Are you still there?
Oh, my mic was muted. Sorry. This will be edited out. Don't worry.
Go
ahead, Kevin.
No, it's fine. Go ahead.
In a liberal democracy like ours, there's oodles of space. There's a free market of political parties, and everyone is hopefully unique. Everyone has certain solutions they wish to propose, and people vote for them, and that is everyone's right to do so. We felt that there wasn't one that represented our views extremely well, so we started our own, and we are very happy to work with others in pursuing a common goal that brings freedom and wealth to the citizens of South Africa. To me, it is that simple.
Kanthan, do you feel that you perhaps represent a sector of politics in South Africa that is not previously been openly welcomed, that everyone is kind of running away from for some
I think the interesting thing right now is that a couple of seconds ago, Jonathan, you were talking about swings to the left and pushback against that. And I think we use words like left and right kind of without really trying to dissect what they actually mean. And in fact, what we have at a number of levels is it's inherently fascism of two kinds that's manifesting itself, for example, in terms of what the EFF does. I don't think of them as a leftist party. In fact, if the closest description I would assign to them is National Socialist, because that's essentially the agenda that they have been pushing. So I do think that there has been this undercurrent that has been pervading the world for a period now, which has attempted to control conversation and shut down particular forms of discussion as being areas that are no-go areas. And I think that that's incredibly dangerous. So, but the people who have been drawing these distinctions in terms of that this person's right-wing, this person's left-wing, that person's alt-right, this person's okay, but they should stay in their lane and all of that kind of stuff. I think it's a distraction from the basics that I think that we should be focusing on, which is what do most people want in their lives? And I think that really what most people want in their lives is they want to be able to enjoy a good quality of life where they're ticking all of the boxes in terms of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And at the end of the day, they want to leave their kids better off than they were. So, and I think if you break it down into those core components, that doesn't really matter whether you categorize yourself as left or right or center or whatever. And I was thinking in terms of actually changing the narrative of our politics so that we're focusing on that core stuff. And I think that that's something that has an opportunity to resonate with most people in this country. So it's a gamble because most people don't think that way. And, maybe I'm going to be proven completely wrong, but somehow I don't think so.
I think it's also important to point out, ordinary people in a democracy are not ideologues at all. As Kanthan just said, most people generally just look at what they want to accomplish in life or what they want to achieve. And if, someone can make that easier for them by removing arbitrary barriers for them as well, that might resonate. You don't need to be called a communist who wants some form of equality under the law. You don't need to be called a fascist if you believe in a certain thing. You can accommodate all of these views while pursuing individual good for most people.
Yeah, just a little bit of pushback against that, though, is that, for example, you talk about people wanting to be able to create a little bit of wealth and perhaps leave their kids something. Sure, but if you're on the left, you want the government to do that for you. And if you're on the right, you're generally a little bit more about individual responsibility, whereas the left is more about the collective responsibility. And so I think that those are important distinctions. We can leave out the far left and the far right for now, but there are different ways of getting to it, and I think you can try and skirt around it as much as you like. Franz Cronier says there's nothing wrong. He calls himself a conservative, and there's nothing wrong with being conservative. I don't think there's anything wrong with being on the right of politics, and certainly we'll get to your manifesto, but your manifesto is very much right-leaning in terms of the politics that are there and how it aims to do those.
No, stop.
Achieve those things.
The smear campaign. I mean, what is this thing about it's right-leaning? I mean, seriously, what does that even mean?
Well, I think that so let's get into it. The left don't like guns, Kenton. Your party does like guns. That puts you on the right of the political spectrum.
No. I disagree with that fundamentally. The left love guns. But they want
themselves
guns.
For the military.
They want guns in the hands of the state.
Yes.
And I, on the other hand, am a Democrat in the sense that I say that everyone should have access to firearms. I'm not saying that everyone should have a gun. I myself do not carry a gun. But I think given that we don't trust the state in every single other thing, surely any reasonable person would say leaving the most corrupt people in our country as the only people who have the capability of killing us is a really stupid thing to do. I mean, what's even slightly right-wing about that? I think it's basic self-defense.
And let us not forget that Karl Marx was anti-gun control. I can quote him. Under no pretext should arms and ammunition be surrendered. Any attempt to disarm the workers must be frustrated by force if necessary. So even gun rights does not fall neatly into political categories. To me, it's a universal civil right for people to be able to defend themselves against other people within the community, other people within the country, and most importantly, against state coercion if it ever comes their way. So even gun rights is not left or right. It's more of a civic, to me, human right.
That's exactly right. If you look in terms of the context of the U.S. in the 1960s through to the early 70s, remember that Malcolm X was a proponent of people arming themselves for self-defense. The Black Panther Party made that a core principle that they were to exercise their Second Amendment rights. And in fact, the state at the time was so threatened by that idea was that they then proceeded to take out the Black Panther Party. But the whole idea that the ability to defend yourself against someone who's trying to take you out really has no political boundaries, left versus right. It's really people who want to hand control over to the state that push that particular agenda, and they exist on both the left and the right.
Yeah, let us not forget that the Black Panther Party were disarmed by the great conservative president, or he was governor of California, Ronald Reagan at the time, with an act that was predicated on the Black Panthers carrying semi-auto rifles in public on the streets because they said they were protecting themselves against racist cops. And Reagan signed a declaration and a law stating that from now on this would be illegal. So yes, even conservatives are for gun control if it suits them.
All right, but I think I take your points, and I never thought I would hear you quote Karl Marx, Ramon, to make a point in your favor. But I think we can talk about modern politics, and I think that modern politics means you would disagree with Hillary Clinton, Bernie Sanders, Kamala Harris, everyone on the left in South Africa, from Julius Malema to every ANC politician pretty much, because they're actually trying to take away all the guns, and many of the people in the DA, in fact, when you talk about guns. So I hear your point, and that it's not necessarily a right or left thing, and it's become more sort of projected that way incorrectly, perhaps. But I do think that there's something to be said for modern politics. But I'd like to sort of get forward to more of your manifesto. So I use guns as one example, and that's just one thing you have in your manifesto. But can we run through it? Would you mind? Happy to do that. All right. So
sorry guys, I was just reaching for the unmute button. Yes, very happy to do that.
Cool. So starting with liberty. So you basically said, look, liberty is a primary value of our country. Before we go on, Kanthan, is it a primary value of our country? Our constitution has a whole bunch of stuff in it that actually restricts your liberty. For example, hate speech laws.
Well,
which
I
then
think
get interpreted.
Yes, I think that if one reads the broad brushstrokes in the preamble of the Constitution, then liberty is actually core to that.
Yes.
And everything kind of flows from that. And what we have at various places through the Constitution are little kind of pit stops that are put in place that try to some extent to circumscribe what exactly the boundaries of that liberty is meant to be. And clearly the free speech clause, for example, I think that the definitions in terms of hate speech as an example, and we've spoken about this in the past, I think that hate speech as a concept doesn't really make sense because, and I think those were really put in order to assuage a handful of people who think, we should really try to be nice to each other and not say nasty things. But I think by and large, if one takes a look at the preamble of the Constitution, and which actually declares the intent of what one needs in order to go forward, then I think liberty is very much at the core of it. But the essence of where the liberty thing comes from, and understand that there's no kind of pecking order in terms of how things go. I think that really, if one looks back to the French Revolution, where it was liberté, égalité, fraternité, liberty, equality, fraternity, and that's really kind of the core of modern democratic systems. The idea, first of all, that you need liberty in order to live your life to the fullest. You need equality in order that people are not given preference over the others. And fraternity is essentially freedom of association. It's the right to be able to join with like-minded people and pretty much do as you want to, obviously constrained by what the first thing or two things do to you. So there's nothing extraordinary in terms of the liberty and equality and fraternity bits that go into our principles. I think, again, speaking of it as a manifesto is kind of misguided. Nobody really cares about manifestos. I promise you ask the average voter, what does the ANC manifesto say? Or what does the DA manifesto say? Or indeed, what does the EFF manifesto say? I think they'll mumble something vague in each case. Like in the case of the ANC, they'll probably say Tumamina. In the case of the EFF, they will say we want our land back. And in the terms of the DA, they'll probably say something like, oh, look, we have blacks too, or something like that.
No alcohol on Sundays.
Okay. No alcohol on Sundays. Yes.
Sure. So is it fair to say that you're looking at liberty and you're interpreting it to mean its best meaning, and that's what you would like to see reflected?
That's right. I think that people actually fail to understand that if you don't ring fence these core principles and measure every way in which we try to change society by these core principles, we inevitably end up gazing into the destructive maw of losing perspective, as a friend of mine once said. Because you forget, instead of stopping to say, wait a second, is this interfering with my liberty? Is it interfering with my equality? Is it interfering with my fraternity? You do end up with problems. That's the root of conflict. If you ensure that you are protecting those three things as the core, then everything else kind of flows from that. But we tend to forget that. We want to do things like correct things that were wrong in the past, but you can't correct things that were wrong in the past by messing with those core principles. And remedial action in terms of the stuff that went down during apartheid, if you can actually identify the people who were personally responsible for doing those things, then obviously you go after them. And, a very clear case of that is with things like that went on with the Nuremberg trials, for example. You held people specifically accountable for things that they did. And the whole idea then of imposing some sort of collective punishment upon the rest of the people who are involved makes no sense whatsoever. We have the same situation out here, where people committed acts of criminality during the apartheid era. And as far as possible, if you can identify the specific criminal and the specific victim, then you go out and you fix that particular problem. But under the guise of trying to offer redress for those people who were the criminals and victims, and try to say, well, we're going to collectively lump all of the people who were not actual victims at the time, but they are vaguely related to those victims. We put them in one category. And everyone who were vaguely related to the perpetrators, we put them in another category. And now let's try and get one of them to pay for the other. And it's fundamentally flawed because it messes with the core concept of equality as a cornerstone of a democratic society. So that's kind of a long-winded way of saying why those three things are really important.
Yeah, but also it's very important to identify and punish those that are directly responsible. When there's a class action lawsuit against a company who did something, you don't sue the driver of the company or the secretary of the company. You sue the board. You sue the directors, the people who actually took the decision that led to harm. And that is the core principle that I think Kanthan is obviously elucidating rather well.
Yeah, that's actually, Roman, that's a very good example because, I had a very good friend, journalist who's now dead. His name is Ronnie Morris. And one of the campaigns that he pushed for was to try and get redress for miners who had been working asbestos mines and obviously fell prey to asbestosis. And pursued a fairly relentless campaign, which eventually led to court action, which finally ended up having some form of redress for the miners who still survived. And, there were only a handful of them. And obviously, asbestosis is a very painful way to die because, Jonathan, I'm sure you can explain the consequences of asbestosis far more eloquently than I can. But fundamentally, the issue that he had to confront was the point of accountability, because the people who had originally owned those asbestos mines, which were then acquired by other companies who were no longer using those as asbestos mines, but because they were the current owners, they were suddenly held accountable for stuff that happened under the previous regime who had sold them the asbestos mines. And it was a really difficult situation to manage from a legal point of view. And eventually a compromise was reached and there was a payout that was made. But it's really difficult to do because here's the way I like contextualizing this. You had apartheid where basically people broke into your house at the dead of night. They stole everything that was under your roof and they took it away and they divided it among other people. Colonialism was pretty much the same thing. People pitched up from other parts of the world, stole the natural resources and took it back to their countries. And the people who did that and then passed on that wealth to a whole range of people are now dead and gone. And your way of actually finding someone that one can hold accountable today is really difficult. So the point is it fair to start holding other people responsible for the stuff that happened in the generations before? I don't think so. There's a fundamental sense of unfairness, because if you recognize the idea that you are responsible for the wrongs that were perpetrated by your ancestors, well, that's really racism in another disguise, isn't it? Because it's really saying that, for example, if you happen to be one of the ancestral rulers of Ghana, and you were responsible for taking Arabs and selling them off into slavery, then, you should be held accountable for it. Because ultimately that was black people selling Arabic people into slavery. And do you hold them accountable for it? I think not.
Yeah, well, this speaks quite nicely into what you have listed, at least, as your second principle, which is individual rights before group rights. One of the things we've sort of railed against on this podcast has been collectivism. And I suppose when you talk about the past, a party like the EFF wants to very much use collectivism to solve problems. So the EFF sees inequality, for example, and they go, well, the problem here is whiteness, essentially. A little bit of collectivism, a little bit of neo-Marxist, postmodernists, however you wish to term it, and that's what they wish to blame. They wish to blame the collective, and then it's quite easy, because then you don't have to find the descendants of people who did things, or even the people who did things. You can just blame an entire group, and so you guys stand against the party, at least, and I know you guys personally as well stand against this sort of collective approach, and believe that the individual is the most important common good, and so that throws any kind of collective policy, government policy, out the window.
Well, it depends on what you mean by collective government policy. You see, if we have some sort of policy that's based on people rallying around particular principles rather than rallying around accidents of birth, I'm probably willing to consider that. But on the other hand, if you are saying that you are excluded specifically because of the fact that your ancestors were born in this particular neighborhood, well, that sounds fundamentally unfair.
Yeah, I think in this context, things like BE, for example, which tends to purposefully favor people just based on skin color, and other policies which have come into play which either favor people on some sort of immutable characteristic, as you mentioned, accidents of birth, be they race, be they gender, or any other type of one of those characteristics that you really can't control and has nothing to do with who you are as a person necessarily.
That's quite right. I think if we use BE as a very specific example, I think that the idea of uplifting people out of poverty is a good idea. And, we may differ in terms of the way in which we think that this should be done. But let's say, for argument's sake, if what we are saying is that we should, in terms of procurement for particular types of, for particular categories of things, we should actually try to give preference to people who have never actually had a chance to participate in this larger ecosystem before, then I'm happy to consider that as a general principle. But the principle should be that the qualification for entry should be economic status and not skin color. So if you really say that people in a particular category of poverty are the people who should be given the first bite of this apple, I'm happy to go along with that, actually, because it's not excluding people on the basis of race. Now, if one looks at the demographics of this country, just because of the fact that the overwhelming majority of this populace happens to be black, I think that the overwhelming majority of such contracts will end up being handed out to black people. And that's okay. But it doesn't divide the nation by creating an exclusionary scenario where, let's say, you happen to have a poor white family. And let's be very clear, there are poor whites, no matter what people may try to say to the contrary. And these are not people who actually benefited from apartheid. In fact, they probably were as poor under the apartheid regime as they are today. But the idea of saying that they get excluded just simply on the basis of their skin color, again, is just fails the test of fairness. And I'm very big on the concept of fairness.
But if I may just interject there, so for example, the procurement thing, where you sort of want to give black businesses a chance to provide the state with stuff. I mean, that's also a fundamental problem for me in a way, and I think I disagree with Kanthan on this one. In that procurement is basically just you moving taxpayers' money around to fulfill the state policy or state requirement. Ideally, you would have equal opportunity in terms of once you have freedom economically and politically, you are able to compete with those that you weren't able to compete before. And then hopefully once you have the competence and you can compete in a general sense with those that you couldn't before, then hopefully people will buy from you or use your service. Not necessarily because you're black, but because you're competent, you provide good service or products. And then perhaps the final requirement would be, let's give the guy a chance. Let's get, this guy to supply us with what we need instead of the usual supplies we've used for 20 years. So it's still a free decision. I don't think the state should have necessarily a role to play in that.
Well, I don't think that we actually need to argue that particular point right now, because broadly speaking, Roman is right in terms of the way in which we structure our economic policies. But I guess that, again, one of the things that we need to look at in terms of how we fix this country, it's kind of like eating an elephant. And really the way in which we eat an elephant is sort of one mouthful at a time. So to give you guys an example, if we look in terms of what we proposed in terms of how we end up fixing particular things around education, one of the things that we proposed is that former Model C schools end up running 2 shifts. And that allows us to make double the use of a physical space. So it's a very quick and effective way of getting more people to benefit from existing facilities. But in the long term, that's not how we fix education. In the long term, fixing education is actually going to require a complete redesign that takes into account distance learning, digital technology. You need the ability for people to learn at different speeds in different subjects. So, for example, you might have a kid who is, let's say, 9 years old, who, in terms of reading levels, is 16 years old, but in terms of ability to play sport is maybe at 5 years old. And one really needs to be able to adjust those things so that you're actually catering at every stage to bring out the best in what that particular child is capable of. And so the idea of treating everyone at the same chronological level, at the same intellectual level, I think is actually quite absurd. There are historic reasons for doing that. But as we've actually evolved the technology, and more to the point, as we've had the ability to do ongoing assessment of capability, making use of things like AI, that has to be the way in which the education system gets redesigned. So the approach right now in terms of things like procurement is very much at that level. We have a system of procurement right now that we are currently stuck with. We can't dismantle that system immediately, but can we do little things that in the short term can immediately make it better and more equitable and, more to the point, actually pulling us together as a nation rather than dividing us? I think that if BEE was sold as something that is geared to alleviating poverty and extricating people out of poverty, I think that there is no one in this country who would turn around and say we are opposed to this. But very specifically, because you are saying that we want to take particular bits of money and give them to a particular class of people, it becomes inherently divisive. It tears the country apart. And really, I think one of the things we're trying to say is, can we focus on narratives that we can all relate to as South Africans, that actually draw us together? And that's a difficult concept to bring about with people who are committed to a race narrative. The reason why they're committed to a race narrative is because it is really the only thing that they have to offer. If you look in terms of their intellectual makeup, they are devoid of any imagination. They are devoid of any strategic thinking other than to say, let's identify a particular category of people that we can legally steal from, and then let's write that into law so that we can steal from them. And that's fundamentally what I'm opposed to.
All right, several good points there. I don't want to get too deep into some of those details, but it gives listeners a lot to chew on, certainly. I do want to chat a little bit. I want to jump around a little bit because the two parts of your sort of principles manifesto that go together, that certainly are a very big part of what I view as the problem in South Africa. And that is the current threat to private property rights, which obviously the ANC, together with the EFF, have agreed to amend Section 25 of our Constitution. You are obviously against that. And then the rule of law, which kind of go together, because the minute you take away property rights, there is no law, essentially. You've removed the basic principle. But over and above that, we obviously have a major problem with enforcement of law, and really any state in the world is really given the monopoly on violence. And the reason they get given that monopoly on violence is because they are entrusted to enforce the law. And even those people who believe in as little government as possible, I exclude those who believe in no government, believe that the state should have the role of enforcing security for its citizens and justice for its citizens. So do you want to talk a bit to those two aspects?
Well, if we can start with property rights, and really the question around property rights. If you look in terms of our Constitution as it is currently structured, we already have the capability of the state to actually expropriate under appropriate circumstances. And really what has changed is this whole idea that you can actually take people's property without actually compensating them fairly. And the whole idea around why people want to do this, let's be very clear about it, is not from the basis of affordability, but it is from the basis of wanting to impose collective punishment primarily upon Afrikaans-speaking people in this country. Let's be very clear about that, because right now, if you look in terms of the amount of money that has already been spent in terms of land claims, and all one would need to do is to actually work out what the cost is in terms of actually compensating people at market value to the economy, and go ahead and do it. And that as a cost to the bottom line of the national budget is far less destructive than setting up a significant proportion of the population to say, we actually want to take what you have built up by force away from you, because that way lies madness. The cost to the economy right now, in terms of us having gone down this path, just in terms of the fact that the ratings agencies have looked with us, there's been an outflow of capital, people immediately become distrustful about wanting to invest in a company, in a country where there's the possibility that whatever you build is going to be taken away from you by an arbitrary rewrite of the law. It just doesn't make sense. So this is really something that is meant to be an emotional draw card for a particular category of voters. And it is the whole idea of imposing collective punishment across an entire group of people. And it is fundamentally wrong. And that's the reason why we should be opposing it. Right now, do I think that the state should have the right to expropriate, for example, to build freeways? Yes, absolutely. Because I think, one can take the view that if you want the economy to keep ticking over, we do end up needing freeways. And it might just so happen that you happen to have a farm in its path, but you pay that particular person a fair market value. And if there happens to be any dispute around what is considered to be fair market value, well, that's why we have the courts, because the courts ultimately will make a decision, and our courts, by and large, have always been extremely fair in terms of how they dispense that type of justice. So what problem are we trying to solve here? The problem that we're trying to solve is the problem of inherent racism on the part of particular categories of people in the ANC and of the EFF, and it has to be fought. It's dangerous. It starts with expropriation from Afrikaans speakers today, but suddenly tomorrow it ends up being expropriation from Xhosa speakers in predominantly Zulu territory. What's to stop that?
Well, absolutely nothing. And the concern is once again that private property, which is hilariously misinterpreted by the Titania McGraw of South Africa and Nakama Brody. The idea that private property merely refers to land, for example, and people not understanding that it refers to everything that any person could possibly own, including their ideas. So this is obviously a major danger. We've discussed it at length on the show, and Ramon, I see you wanted to just chime in as well. I'm not sure if you just wanted to add on top of what Kanthan had already said.
Yes, let me just explain. So, private property is obviously not just land, but it's also the person, right? We wouldn't want to live in a society where we think that, a person's kidneys are available for the masses, for the good of the masses, to make the masses whole again. We don't want to live in a society where, people are pinned down and the kidneys are cut out, for the greater good. So, if you take that principle of private property as a person's body and extend that to a person's creation, to a person's residence, to a person's ideas, to a person's output, then obviously you can see why private property is such an important value that we have, personally me and of course the Capitalist Party of South Africa, because all other rights flow from property rights. If you come to my house and you swear or you call people derogatory names, that your freedom of speech is limited by my property rights. I will kick you out of my house for doing that. So, as you can see, and I'm trying to explain, property rights are the integral part of a society that is based on freedom and wealth. And it should be sacrosanct. And if property was stolen before, it needs to be returned. All the people that were dispossessed need to be compensated. No one would disagree with that principle. But the argument that we need to expropriate everything to compensate a few is obviously wrong. But also, we need to expropriate from those who are not at all responsible for dispossession to make others whole is also wrong. Because once again, you're punishing people who are not involved with the original crime. And that is a big danger of expropriation without compensation. These are restitution is a complex topic, and it needs to be thought of in a very, very calm and balanced way. With the first choice being property rights are sacrosanct, how can we make others whole, and what opportunities and what can we do to make others whole without necessarily infringing on the rights of others.
All right, so let's talk quickly to the rule of law. I did mention it as well earlier in relation to property rights. Maybe we could perhaps, instead of being too broad, just give us an idea, Kanthan or Ramon, how you fix the rule of law in a country that has amongst the world's highest murder, rape, armed robbery rates in the world.
And again, this is such this goes back to the eating the elephant problem, because it really has to be one bite at a time. The idea, first and foremost, that we have incompetent policemen and women is absolutely core to this. And we have a proposal in place in terms of how we fix that, which basically requires that you start recruiting people to be to join the police force who happen to have university degrees. And the reason why we are saying that this is possible is because the ANC has told us for the longest time that there are more than 250,000 people out there who have university degrees and are unemployed. So we're just saying raise the bar and only hire policemen and policewomen from those ranks. But that's just the starting point. I think a more crucial thing that one needs to look at is, should policing actually be a national competence? I think the answer to that is absolutely not. Policing is one of those functions that needs to be devolved down to the lowest levels of society possible. So what that means is that if you happen to have a small community that is out maybe 50 k's from the nearest city, the recruitment and the training and the appointment of people to actually be part of that police force should be a local competence. And in fact, the police chief in that area, I believe, should actually be an elected official of that particular area. So if you had a situation, for example, where all of the people in particular municipal boroughs, in our case, in the urban areas, were actually electing the head of the local police station, you've immediately got a person who's got skin in the game, who is going to actually ensure that policing that is carried out in that district is carried out to the interests of people who actually live in that particular district. So this, again, has so many legs to it. The reason why right now we have a complete inability to actually solve problems of crime. I mean, Helen Ziller has this problem over and over again. Because policing is a national competence, the Western Cape has been constantly understaffed in terms of police presence, because the National Commissioner of Police actually doesn't give a rat's ass about what happens in the Western Cape, and so proceeds to redeploy police to other parts of the country, such as the VIP protection units. And that's why you have portions of the Western Cape that have the highest murder rates in the entire country. It's because there is no policing resources that actually gets allocated out there. So there's many things that one needs to do to even start unscrambling this omelette. But we are saying there has to be baby steps. And I think the most fundamental thing that we proposed right now is, for recruitment going forward, just take only university graduates, because at least you know that they can read, write, and count, that they can actually pull together a crime docket that is legible and is not going to get tossed out in court. But yeah, baby steps.
Yeah, and more to the point of the decentralization of the police force, different parts of the country have different sorts of crime. So, I mean, if you have a town in the middle of the Karoo, I would suspect a big criminal operation might be stock theft. So you need people who are trained in that sort of crime to deal with that sort of crime. If you're a policeman in a city like Johannesburg, you need to be worried about violent crime like rape, interpersonal crime, things like that. But those are two separate competencies. And to believe that you can sort of engineer this from a central point in Pretoria, A, is very difficult, and B, obviously is not working, as we can see now. So it is very good to have different competencies for different parts of the country that need them the most. It's about having a flexible police force that deals with the issues on the ground in that geographical area.
All right, Kanthan, I want to talk about your stance on freedom of expression. So you guys talk about tolerance and freedom of expression as a principle. Let's maybe put it in the context of the South African flag debate that's currently going on, because many people in this country would like to ban the old South African flag, and because they feel that it's hurtful to other people. It's not going to do any harm, some claim, to ban it. And it may help to just alleviate some sort of emotional suffering by those who feel harmed by seeing the old flag, be it in a social media photograph of someone sitting in a bar somewhere or whatever it happens to be. It's not exactly like the flag is all over the place.
Look, the first thing that I need to point out is that when I see the old South African flag, if someone is waving the old South African flag, I'm going to turn around and actually, laugh at the guy and say, yeah, idiots, you're waving the flag for the losing side, and that's so cool. I mean, really, you guys lost, so that's fine. Keep your flag, and we'll keep our democracy, and can we move on? Because we've actually got a country to live in these days. And the number of you that actually pitch up waving this flag is so small compared to the number of people who are actually willing to stand with hand on heart every time the current South African flag goes up, and how many of us are willing to stand hand on heart and sing the national anthem. We outnumber you probably about 99.9%. So why are we even paying attention to these idiots? What is the problem that we are trying to solve?
Well, I agree with you fully. I don't think this is a major problem. I think it's a distraction in terms of the flag. But we have increasingly draconian legislation and judicial rulings with regards to hate speech. There's an attempt to increase the words you're not allowed to say, or the things you're not allowed to say about people. And there really is a sort of Orwellian approach to speech and to freedom of expression in South Africa. And I assume you both stand firmly against that.
Well, I think the whole idea, first and foremost, that you should have particular categories of speech that are completely outlawed. And, inevitably the example that one comes up with is Holocaust revisionism. And we know that Holocaust revisionism is a huge problem around the world. And my take on that always has been that if you take people who are pushing a Holocaust revisionist agenda and you try and outlaw Holocaust revisionism, what you're really doing is driving them underground. And I don't want them driven underground. I actually want them out in the open so that Mossad, for example, can actually identify these guys and ensure that they are closely monitored so that they are not suddenly going to turn around and start shooting up a synagogue. I think it's important that we know that people be allowed to say exactly what they are thinking, because it allows the rest of us to actually protect ourselves against them. So if there are racists out there, I want to be able to identify them so that I can take adequate steps to ensure that, this person who actually happens to be in my neighborhood is not suddenly going to pitch up in the dead of night and, hold my family hostage. People don't think through the consequences of these actions. what are we trying to do by driving hatred underground? Hatred is real. It is not going to go away. But trying to say that there are particular categories of speech that should be outlawed. Look, the first thing that you do, as I said, is drive people underground. The second thing that you do is you actually create a victim mentality on the part of these people. And whenever you have a victim mentality, as we see every day on Twitter, then other people rally to your side because of the fact that you claimed victimhood. And victimhood is very powerful in attracting more people to your cause. And the last thing that I want is for racists or for Nazis or the like to be in a position to say, actually, the state is against us and therefore you need to join our cause. This is the most basic level of common sense, and I don't get why people are not able to see that.
I don't. I mean, I have an answer, and I think you've partially explained it. It's all about the victimhood, and you get points for being a victim these days, and you can very much get ahead in life through intersectionality. You can very much get ahead by hitting the right boxes of intersectionality, each of which gives you a certain amount of victim points, and the person who hits or ticks the most amount of boxes in terms of that is the winner. And that's how you win these days. You win by being a victim, not by being successful, actually. So I suppose that's really the reason, and that's where a lot of this comes from. Certainly in the South African context, I think there is a lot of history here with regards to the way people were treated, and it is true that people probably feel inadequate or feel hurt or feel downtrodden when they're living in what is supposed to be a free country and what they view as a free country for them, and they see the symbol of oppression, I guess, that was the symbol that was held up when they weren't free. So I suppose that is the argument for the other side. I may be not steel manning it as well as I could because I don't particularly identify with that argument. But I guess that's the way I would go. But I tend to agree with you in terms of when you try to limit free speech, you have negative outcomes, including driving it underground, making it worse. And I also believe that the biggest problem is that it's all subjective. Today, the flag is the old South African flag is objectionable to someone. In 50 years' time, when we look back on Life Esidimeni and another 20 Life Esidimenis or 300 Life Esidimenis, will we consider the current flag to be oppressive and to be a symbol of the worst we did as a country? Who knows? And so these things are always subjective.
Let me just toss in a bit of an anecdote at this point. Obviously growing up under apartheid, the Die-Stem as the national anthem was, an object of utter revulsion for most of us who are not white. You see, the interesting thing about Die-Stem is if you cut down to dissecting what the song actually means, and what the lyrics actually mean. It's actually quite a beautiful piece of work. But what it stood and what it represented during the apartheid era was something that was really repulsive. And I had a profound hatred for that piece of music every time it would play on the airwaves when SABC was shutting down close to midnight, as good Calvinists would do back in the day. And then we got into the New South Africa, and then we ended up with the new national anthem, which was basically a shortened version of Nkosazana Africa, which I used to sing the full-length version at almost every gathering during the apartheid era. Whether you were in ANC circles or in Black consciousness circles, you stood up and you sang Nkosazana Africa. And then we got to the New South Africa, and we had this melding of the two anthems. And for the longest time, what I would do is I would sing the first part, Nkosazana Africa, and I would, then stay silent for the second part. And then what suddenly made me change my mind was one day when the President Mandela, was at a gathering in a church, which they ended up, they started the proceedings by playing Nkosi Sikelel' Africa. And then they tried to go on with the program after that. And Mandela stood up and went to the front. And he cut them out from a dizzy height. And he said, you will pay the full proper national anthem. And can we please do this now? And he went back and sat down. And they then proceeded to sing the full national anthem, which was Nkosi Sikelel' Africa, and De-Stem. And I must tell you that I was actually shamed at that point into rethinking my position. I said, if this guy who has spent, 27 years in captivity, can turn around and actually say, we need to do this because it is the right thing to do, then surely I can be big enough to actually do that. And, from that time, I now stand hand on heart and I sing the entire national anthem, loudly and lustily through the entire thing. And I think that is actually a good thing to do. But the reason why I was bringing up this anecdote is that people forget that on the 27th, not the 27th of April, on the day that Nelson Mandela was inaugurated as the first president of a free democratic South Africa, he took his oath of office under the old South Africa flag.
Yeah, I think
people forget this.
It's interesting. It is interesting to remember all of these things. This anecdote you give is quite interesting in the fact that we do miss politicians like that these days who, I know Ramon's not a huge fan of the idea of unity, but who at least don't aim to create unnecessary division where it doesn't need to exist, where there isn't actually cause for it to exist. And we seem to have gone further and further down this rabbit hole of politicians who almost build popularity using that method.
Well, in my defense, if I may, I'm not against unity in the sense that I really want people to fight for the ideas that they believe in, but hopefully these are fundamental ideas about life and the good and things like that. Fighting about flags and these relatively minor issues, it bugs me a little bit. But so if there's unity around principles about not banning flags, for example, I accept that completely. But it is disunity in terms of particular policy proposals or laws for a particular reason. I think there needs to be a great amount of debate and argument around them based on the various principles people have. I will fight and create lots of disunity if something curtails freedom in any way, for example. But I think that is necessary. But if there's massive disunity around the banning of around a flag, for example, that is far more a distraction than a real cause of political disunity. I hope that makes sense.
Indeed, I think it does. Gents, we don't have too much time left. We haven't finished everything, but we've got a lot of meat here. I want to get to the thing that is probably emblematic of what a capitalist party should be, which is what you list as point 8. Although Kanthan, you did make the point that they're not necessarily ordered, but about free markets, and perhaps I should read it because I think it's a very good point. Free markets and international free trade based on enlightened self-interest. Economic exchange is voluntary activity between individuals. The state should not tell people where to work, how to save, what to build, what to produce. Leaving things to the free market rather than government planning or organization increases prosperity, reduces poverty, increases jobs, provides goods that people want to buy. Our country's economic interests should not be compromised because of the state's political prejudices. If the best source for oil is Iran or the best source for technology is Israel, such trade should be given preference. That is a very capitalistic approach to doing business and to running a country. And do you want to expand on that? Does it need any expansion? Perhaps you want to talk to why we don't do that at the moment, given that the data shows that capitalism has brought pretty much the entire world out of poverty, to the fact that they have to actually now move the criteria for what constitutes poverty, because those people almost don't exist anymore.
Well, I think let me just kind of hop in at the start. The question of buying oil from Iran, for example, there's a significant number of our people who have a profound revulsion for the Islamic Republic of Iran, just simply because of a range of things that they have done and continue to do in terms of persecution of particular categories of citizens. But we also buy oil from Saudi Arabia, which, if anything, is even worse than the Iranians in terms of those particular categories. And if you look at our country right now, in terms of the refineries that we have, the refineries that we have are all designed to process particular categories of oil. And it's been a while since I actually investigated the different categories, but, we have, there's light sweet crude, light sour crude, heavy sweet, heavy sour, and all of these categories. And right now, our refineries in this country can only process particular categories of crude oil. And it just so happens that those come from two of these most repulsive places in the Middle East. That's the Saudis and the Iranians. And frankly, our decision in terms of which of those we choose to buy our oil from should be in terms of what's giving us the best value for the country. And surely that's actually sort of self-evident. We can't buy oil from Angola because of the fact that our refineries can't process that oil. We can't buy oil from Nigeria because our refineries cannot process that oil. Unless we are now going to re-equip our country with new refineries, which is absolutely ridiculous, because we'd never be able to pay back the money that we would spend on those refineries. So the whole idea of actually saying what is the best way for us to be spending money in terms of our oil purchases really needs to be taken into account. Now, obviously, there's a complication in terms of Iran, in the sense that the U.S. has unilaterally imposed sanctions upon that country. Now, as a country, we then need to step back and say, are we going to be on principle buying oil from Iran, or do we actually value AGOA, the African Growth Opportunity Act, as being more vital to our country's survival? But that's a discussion that needs to be had, not on the basis of whether we support U.S. or Iran, but on the basis of whether AGOA is better for our long-term interests as a country than buying oil from Iran. So that's kind of one piece of the puzzle. Now, let's take a look at the buying tech from Israel thing. If you look in terms of this absolute bloody disaster that we had in the Western Cape around the water shortages, when we could have very quickly sourced desalination plants from the Israelis, who really are absolutely the best in the world in terms of this particular type of tech. And we could have fixed that entire problem almost immediately. But the reason why the governments there were not willing to do that is because they are afraid of the optics around actually dealing with Israel. And I think this is actually ridiculous. You are actually holding back our ability to actually provide water, which is the most basic level of survivability for the people of this country, because of the fact that you are playing politics. No, that's absolutely ludicrous. Now, should we have a standpoint in terms of, whether there needs to be resolution of the entire Israeli-Palestinian conflict? Yes, absolutely, I think we do. I have a personal viewpoint on that. I believe that there is a right to an independent Palestinian state, but I also support the right of an independent Israeli state. And the way in which one actually negotiates around that is by actually engaging in all of the parties as an honest broker, rather than shutting out one particular piece of the puzzle, because that doesn't really end up solving the problem. So, as a country, does it make sense that, we are not looking to Israel for agriculture? Let's take the question right now of people wanting to take large profitable farms away from the people who are currently running them. Frankly, if you end up with Israeli tech-based drip irrigation facilities that are assessing every individual plant in a particular greenhouse for its growth and drip feeding just that specific plant with the appropriate amount of nutrients to ensure that it's hitting the appropriate level of productivity, you suddenly end up completely obviating the need to take away those large-scale farms. So again, this is a question of the people who are currently running our country just being so fucking clueless about how to actually fix the country that they don't know that the best way of solving the problem of feeding the nation is going to be on a small scale. It is not going to be on solving the large-scale problems. I mean, Israel is probably one of the most water-scarce countries in the world. But we forget that Jordan's water supply depends on Israel piping water to them. Both the West Bank and Gaza would die of thirst if Israel was not supplying them with water. And how can we be so blinkered that we are not actually recognizing this stuff and saying what we need to do is to actually work with these guys, and we need to try to provide some measure of actually ensuring that their safety and security is protected so that they can take some of the pressure off in terms of how they deal with the Palestinian issue. But that's enlightened self-interest. You know, we show the rest of the world that we are willing to negotiate on the basis of what serves our interests first. And the Chinese, bless their hearts, are actually the best in the world at doing this. The Chinese always put the interests of the Chinese first. They don't actually play silly buggers around, you know, what optics are we trying to achieve in terms of who we're trying to assuage in the world out there.
Well, excellent. Kanthan, I feel like we could go on for another hour, but unfortunately we don't have it. Ramon and I are both going to be load shed in the next short while. And I'm not sure how your schedule is. I think we're going to have to call it there this time and perhaps continue to have discussions with you going forward. I think it will be interesting. Elections are 2 months away, so I do wish your party good luck, as I've wished all the other parties that have come on the show good luck. And it will be interesting to see the showing that you guys are able to have.
Yeah, I think luck doesn't really feature much in this conversation, Jonathan. I think it's really at the level of saying we have a set of core values. We've got these 10 principles that we believe in that actually unites us, and it's those 10 things that unite us. It's not the things that we disagree with, because if I take a look down the 10 core people that we've got on our list right now, there are probably touch points that we would disagree with quite fundamentally. I mean, religion would be one of those touch points. I'm an atheist, but is it possible for me as an atheist to actually have these core shared values with a person who's intensely religious? Yes, absolutely. And if we work on the assumption that there are enough of us as human beings who believe in these 10 core principles and are willing to actually come together around these 10 core principles, then I think that's not a question of luck. That's really a question of trying to be able to connect and trying to be able to get the correct messages out. And it is hugely difficult. And it's difficult because of the fact that the narrative that pervades our society right now is one of division. And I actually think that as a nation, we're better than that. I think that as a nation, we're actually good people who on a day-to-day basis, we talk well to each other. We actually get on splendidly. And if we can actually reach out to enough people and say, we want to unite around these 10 core principles, are you with us? Can we persuade at least 500,000 people out of 55 million to come on board with us? I don't think that's a big ask. I think that's actually quite achievable. But it's about reaching enough of those people. And it's going to be, forums like this one that's going to be utterly crucial in talking to those people and engaging with them in exactly the same way we do right now. It's not about trying to shut down debate on particular viewpoints. It is about actually having polite conversations, agreeing to disagree where you can, but more crucially, trying to say, what can we agree on? Can we agree on these crucial things and use that as the starting point? Instead of saying, a number of people have come to me, for example, saying, I really could support your party, but if not for the fact that you have gun rights in there. And my response is always, well, I'm sorry you feel that way, but can we park that as a point of discussion and tell me how you feel about the other 9 points? Because if you feel strongly about the other 9 points, the question you should then ask yourself is is your disdain for gun rights more important than your love of the other 9 rights? And that really needs to be the way in which we go forward as a country. Let's start with what we can agree upon and then look at how we address the points that we disagree with.
Excellent. Ramon, final words?
Yeah, well, I cannot agree more with my esteemed chairman on this point. Yes, the principles we have chosen are carefully considered. There's lots of evidence and history to show that they do work, and I think they espouse the greatest characteristics of what South Africa can be, and actually what it is at the moment. I do think there is still, despite all the warnings, there is still a lot of free speech in this country. There is a lot of enterprise, lots of people wanting to get ahead by putting in the work, by being innovative. And we just want to express that at a level where people can look at us and say, you see, thankfully I'm being represented in a political field when I wasn't before. And that's the essence of the Capitalist Party. On a personal note, I will still be part of the Renegade Report. I'll be here every week. This won't become a platform for the Capitalist Party whatsoever. The Renegade Report will still carry on as is, and I'm more than happy to be a hardworking entrepreneur and juggle, a few roles at the same time. But Kanthan, thank you very much for joining us on what must have been a very tiring day, especially the day after the launch. And yes, we will certainly be in touch. And for the listeners, I hope that you really enjoyed what Kanthan had to say.
Thanks, guys. Cheers.
Thanks, Kanthan. So just final words is if you enjoy the podcast, as always, thank you for supporting us. We have moved on to a new feed. So if you know anyone who usually listens to the podcast and hasn't moved over to the new feed, please do make them go on to whichever podcast app they use. We're also on Spotify now, and you can find us there. Just resubscribe to the show. It does seem as if most of you have done that in terms of the numbers we're seeing, but if you know of anyone who's not aware of this, please do let them know. We also have launched a new website, renegadereport.co.za. You can go over there if you'd like to support the show, give us some donations. As you know, we are all self-funded. And we use the funds that you give us to build the show, to expand the show, to do what we're doing right now, which is getting into a new studio shortly, and bring you better content and ever more from what is becoming a broader platform. So we appreciate it. Thanks as always for listening, and we will catch you next time. Cheers.
Cheers.